to navigating the rural, remote, and northern data landscape. I'm Catherine Ploufjeté with the Canadian Women's Foundation, and I'm going to get us started before I hand it off to our guest speaker, Asia Mason, from the Yukon Status of Women Council. So some technical details before we start. If you haven't already, please click the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen and select a language channel. We have interpreters today working today to make sure everyone's words are translated. So please now select English or French from the option to ensure a seamless experience for you. En français maintenant, si ce n'est pas déjà fait, vous pouvez cliquer l'option Interprétation au bas de votre écran et sélectionner l'option Anglais ou Français. Nous avons avec nous des interprètes qui travaillent aujourd'hui à rendre l'expérience agréable pour tout le monde. The work of the Canadian Women's Foundation and that the program we support take place on traditional First Nations, Métis, and Inuit territories. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet and work on this land. However, we recognize that land acknowledgements are not enough. We need to pursue truth, reconciliation, decolonization, and allyship in an ongoing effort to make right with all our relations. If you don't know us, the Canadian Women's Foundation is a national leader in the movement for gender equality in Canada. Through funding, research, advocacy, and knowledge sharing, we work to achieve systemic change. We support women, girls, and gender diverse people to move out of violence, out of poverty, and into confidence and leadership. Since 1991, our partners and donors have contributed to more than $150 million to fund over 2,500 life-transforming programs throughout the country. If you have questions, you can type them into the Q&A box during the event. We will monitor this box and pose your questions at the end of the session, doing our best to get to as many as possible. If you're having any tech issues, please feel free to write into the chat box and we'll do our best to assist you. Finally, at the end of this event, there will be a survey available. Please take the time to give your feedback if you can. Okay, so now I'm going to hand it over to Asia Mason.
Good morning, everyone. Can folks hear me okay and see me okay? Getting some thumbs up, thanks. So just bear with me while I share the beginnings of what will be the entire webinar slide deck. And just to situate what today is going to look like, we're going to go through some of the things that we as an organization have learned over the course of 50 years of grassroots advocacy. And you'll notice in the agenda that after toolkit, there is not anything, but we want to emphasize that there's going to be a Q&A period at the end of this presentation, where we're hoping we can engage with folks and unpack some of the things that we talk about today. So a little bit about who we are as an organization. Like I mentioned, we're the Yukon Status of Women Council. We are not governmental like some Status of Women councils. We are a non-governmental organization. Our mandate is very much backline, which is to say we focus a lot on research, policy analysis, and education. Our office is located on the traditional territories of the T'an-Kwatchin Council and the Kwanlin Dun First Nation. And we are a very small team. In total, we have, I think, 7 folks working with us. Our projects are largely driven by funding that's available. Our core funding, like many organizations who are probably here today with us is quite small. Our core funding is $49,000 a year. So all of that is to say, we are able to do the work that we do when and if we get funding for specific projects. This particular initiative, this Rural, Remote, and Northern Data Gaps initiative, was born largely out of not only the Canadian Women's Foundation and the funding that they provided through their shockproofing communities funding streams, but also through WAGE, the federal department's capacity building funding. As far as myself, I am the executive director of the Yukon Status of Women Council. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a white settler who was born and raised on the traditional territories of the Kwanlin First Nation, as well as the Carcross-Tagish First Nation. And we wanted to ensure that today's webinar is tailored to the needs of the folks who've joined us today. And so we're going to invite people to take a few minutes to do a quick poll. And over the course of the next, however long it takes to get through the slide deck, Jess Dorward/Stone, who is the Yukon Status of Women Council's project manager, is going to be quickly analyzing the poll results, and will then use those poll results to tailor which tools in the toolkit we kind of zoom in on, if that makes sense. So I'm hoping that my CWF counterparts can plug the polls. I should say the poll because I understand it's in French and in English, into the chat, and I'll invite participants to take a few minutes. It shouldn't take very long to complete that poll. And we'll meet back, again, we're on Yukon time, so it's 10:10 right now. So we'll give folks 5 minutes to complete that poll. So we'll come back together at 1:15, wherever that is. And I apologize for folks who might be joining from Newfoundland, because that would be 1:45, I believe. So yeah, please go ahead and complete that poll. If you've pounded through that poll, I'll also invite folks to plug in who they are in the chat. I understand that the chat is open for everyone. This is a great way for people to know who's in the room with us. And, oh, it looks like the chat is disabled. Scratch that. I'll also just let folks know that we do have a Q&A enabled for this webinar. And over the course of the webinar, we invite you to input your questions into the Q&A box. And that Q&A box should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen, right next to where the chat feature would be. And at the end, we're going to address some questions. And Jess, who is part of the YSWC team, is going to be ensuring that if there's similar questions being asked, that she'll try to make sure they're not being skipped over. And she'll also, oh, it looks like there's something happening with an anonymous attendee. And Jess is all over it. I would suggest, in the case, if you're not able to bypass it, if you could pick an answer that fits your situation the closest, if that's possible. All right, folks. Just want to make sure everybody can still see the slide deck. And you should be seeing page 2. Jess, could you give me a thumbs up that you can see page 2? All right. Thank you, Patty. So I just want to give a bit of context as to why we're putting together this particular side project. In the Yukon, we are often asked as an organization to provide data on gender-based violence, as well as other gender justice issues. And consistently, I find myself, I think, among other folks working in an organization that really is backline, I find myself really hesitant to offer StatsCan data and to offer Yukon Bureau Statistics data. And that's because we know those data are insufficient. They do not reflect the real story of what's happening for folks in the Yukon. All of that is to say, part of the intention of this webinar and this toolkit is really to put those thoughts onto paper, so to speak, or in this case, into a digital space where other advocates who live in rural, remote, and northern spaces can actually unpack the mechanisms and use the reasoning and the illustrations that we're providing here as a way to mobilize knowledge about the data gaps that exist in rural, remote, and northern contexts. At the end of the day, for us, we want to promote good governance, good government, and that involves accountability, transparency, but it also involves policy and decision-making that uses quality data and evidence. And so if the data that are available through sources like Statistics Canada are not actually capturing what's happening for folks with these lived experiences, we would like to know how it is that governments and decision makers are making those decisions with evidence, if at all. We recognize there are fundamental limitations on the kinds of data that can be collected and reported on in rural, remote, and northern contexts. But because of those fundamental limitations, whether that's privacy laws and so forth, we are excluding a lot of the people who are in the margins of the margins. Those folks aren't being captured and included in the evidence that ought to be shaping policies and decisions. I'm just moving on to page number 3. So we're gonna unpack now what we at least consider quality data. And obviously, so much of this is based on learnings and the shoulders of our foremothers and foregrandmothers and those who came before us and have done an immense amount of work to educate and show us what constitutes good policy and what constitutes quality data. So for us, we recognize that quality data needs to be intersectional. In the case of the blob that you see on the left, you'll notice that the individual, the silhouette in the middle, we've indicated that their power, privilege, and identity is really shaped by the first concentric ring, that gray ring, which are aspects of their identity. And those are things like class, geographic location, i.e. rural remoteness, their social status, their age, their ethnicity. The blue ring around the gray ring denotes or describes systems of power. Systems of power include things like racism, misogyny, classism, and so forth. The outer ring is the structural and institutional and systemic forces that interact with those systems of power and interact as well with an individual's aspects of identity. When we look at specific individuals, we see that different combinations of aspects of identity combine in different ways, which in turn determines what kinds of systems of power they're beholden to, if you will. I'm moving on to page 4. And again, we're still talking about what constitutes quality data, especially in rural, remote, and northern contexts, but everywhere. So we just did a little, few-minute briefing on intersectionality and what constitutes intersectionality. But one of the features that I think a lot of people who might not have a background in research or are new to the sector of gender-based violence advocacy, and for that matter, a lot of the policy and decision makers who don't live and work in this world, the idea of disaggregated data is a word that we're starting to hear more and more, but really we're not doing a really great job of unpacking what that means. So in order for us as advocates, and in order for us as advocates who are trying to promote evidence-based policy and decision-making, we know we need an intersectional analysis, but an intersectional analysis requires access to disaggregated data. So you'll notice in the blob on the right that the aspects of this individual's identity, that gray circle, things like their gender, their ethnicity, their sex, their class, when those features or aspects of identity are not available, or when we cannot disaggregate data that is, look at how, for example, sex and gender combine with ethnicity to understand how the systems of power might affect that individual. We're invisibilizing that individual. We're talking here about those folks who are in the margins of the margins. The point we're hoping you can take home from this slide is that in rural, remote, and northern spaces where privacy laws, practices, and procedures often restrict and limit how much disaggregated data we can have access to, we are invisibilizing a lot of people. I'm now moving on to page 5. So I've alluded to this a few times, and this is important. And I want to take a step back and not suggest necessarily that we're advocating for a massive law reform initiative around privacy legislation. There's really important reasons why privacy and confidentiality legislation exists. Examples of that kind of legislation are the Federal Privacy Act. In the Yukon Territory, it's the Yukon's Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, the Yukon's Health Information Privacy and Management Act. These frameworks, these legislative frameworks exist to ensure that individuals' private information isn't being misused. And we're not suggesting that that's a bad thing. However, when it comes to the work that so many of us do as advocates, especially in the gender-based violence sector, these privacy legislation frameworks become a barrier for us to access disaggregated data. And in turn, we're not able to get that level of specificity or granularity or actual lived experiences of people who are most affected by social issues. So it's a bit of a head scratcher. On the one hand, we recognize the importance of privacy and confidentiality. We recognize that in so many of our communities where everybody knows everybody, we do run the risk of revealing a specific individual if too many aspects of identity are reported on. But on the other hand, it begs the question, if we're not able to report or produce information that has the level of detail that we know we need to inform evidence-based policy and decision-making, we often find ourselves in a situation where we're stuck. I've now moved on to page 6. So this is just to summarize what we've just talked about. We know that the quality of data in rural, remote, and northern contexts is low. We know that that's because aspects of identity, like sex, ethnicity, sexuality, so forth, they're not always collected. And we're gonna go into some examples about that a little later on. We also know that the categories that are being used with relation to aspects of identity are not always comparable. So an example of that would be Statistics Canada only including sex and not gender in a lot of their surveys, and other frameworks for data collection using a delineated, they don't conflate sex and gender. Other data collection frameworks will have sex as something that stands distinct from gender. We also recognize that, as I mentioned before, legislative policy and practice frameworks are built with the prioritization of anonymity, and that limits our ability to do an intersectional analysis, because we can't do an intersectional analysis without disaggregated data. We also recognize that the quality of data is low in rural, remote, and northern spaces because community-based research is not prioritized, nor is it funded. This point cannot be emphasized enough, and we're going to unpack that a little bit later on. Non-governmental organizations and NGOs that have been chronically underfunded for decades often lack the capacity to collect data. I don't know any shelter in the North, or for that matter, in a rural, remote context, where there's a position to do data analysis or develop data governance frameworks. We all know how tired and exhausting and underpaid the work is. The last thing that we are going to allocate resources towards is data collection. And finally, the vast majority of gender-based violence is not reported. Therefore, the quality of data that we have access to does not represent what's actually happening to people. Moving on to slide 7, we're gonna hone in on gender-based violence as an example. And I want to invite folks to remember that this toolkit doesn't apply specifically to gender-based violence per se. It can be applied to a multitude of issues. But the gender-based violence example is so telling and clear as to what we're trying to describe. So what you're seeing in front of you on page 7 is all of these dots at the very top of the screen are meant to reflect every single occurrence or incident of gender-based violence. Here we're talking intimate partner violence, sexualized violence, and so forth. The yellow dots are meant to represent gender-based violence that is unreported. The teal dots represent gender-based violence that does get captured through things like survey data. And when we mean survey data, that can apply to both governmental and non-governmental entities, if you will. So, for example, survey data can include research that's done by grassroots organizations, but it can also include things like the census. The blue dots represent administrative data as it relates to gender-based violence. Here we're talking specifically about reported incidents to RCMP and policing. We're talking about coroner's reports and how different causes of death are categorized. The funnel below, you'll notice, I hope folks can see that, you notice that there are no yellow dots going into that funnel. And that's because the data nets, if you will, or the data funnels are a rate limiting factor. The funnels and what goes through these data capturing funnels are what often determine the gender-based violence response systems, which in our fancy little picture here are denoted by the mountains below. There is an absence of yellow in the systems because unreported occurrences of gender-based violence do not inform the systems. And this is especially the case in rural, remote, and northern contexts. I'm now going to move on to page 8. So this is a bit of a recap, but in essence, we're advocating, we, as in the Yukon Status of Women Council, we as in advocates writ large, we're advocating for there to be more inclusion of the lived experience of people whose lives are impacted by things like gender-based violence to be included in the systems that are built to respond to those issues. We want to see pathways funded, pathways built, prioritized in decision-making that are driven and informed by the people whose experiences are not captured, fundamentally not captured in the data collection systems that exist currently. One of the tools or ways that we can do that is through community-based research. I just want to pause for a moment and give folks a heads up that we're going to delve into some really specific examples. And in these examples, we're going to be talking about opioid overdose deaths. And we're also going to be talking about sexualized violence in the context of Indigenous women. So I just want to prep folks, we're going to be looking at numbers. And I invite you to disengage or turn off your screen or leave, take a break if it's too much. I also want to invite folks to remember that as we're going through these examples, we want to ask these 4 questions. Is this an example of disaggregated data? In turn, are we able to do an intersectional analysis? Is the data accessible? And finally, is this an example of a decision that was made from quality data? I'm now on page 11. And what you see in front of you is a news release from the Yukon Coroner's Office, dated May 5th, 2023. Between April 7th and April 27th of this year, 8 people died. The Yukon, like everywhere, is contending with tainted drug supply and an opioid crisis. People are dying. I want to be clear that I'm not trying to pick on the coroner, the chief coroner, when we're unpacking this particular example. Heather Jones, the chief coroner of the Yukon, is a fierce advocate, but her office is also limited by things like the Coroner's Act. And the Coroner's Act is another example of legislation in the Yukon that limits what kinds of information can be reported publicly. So in the teal box with the arrow, I'm going to invite you to take a look at what was being published or what is being published in this report. You're going to notice that we can tell how many of the 8 people who died between April 7th and April 27th. We can tell their sex, that is, how many were female and how many were male. We can also tell how many were First Nations. And we can also tell their ages. So those are all examples of that first layer in the intersectionality blob of aspects of identity. What we can't tell, though, is how many First Nations women died, or how old the women who died were. This is a very good example of non-disaggregated data or limited disaggregation. Taking that a step further, if we don't know how many Indigenous women died as a result of opioid overdose, we're less able to advocate for systemic change and effective responses that are tailored and calibrated to the populations who are most affected. I also just want to take a moment to say that part of what is hard in rural, remote, and northern spaces is that we're all connected. We're all like 2 degrees of separation. We use Facebook. And so when I log on to Facebook, I see exactly who died. I know who she is. I know she was Indigenous. And so sometimes it can't help but feel like there's a bit of systemic gaslighting going on. We know what's actually happening, but a lot of the privacy laws were written in a time that predates things like social media and social networking. So I'm going to invite people to remember what our initial position is. How are policies and decisions being made? And what constitutes evidence? We're now going to talk about sexualized violence. And this is specifically a screenshot that you're going to be able to access in the references on the last slide. I'm on slide or page 12 right now. Statistics Canada has recently updated their website and has enabled, if you know how to click enough boxes and have the fortitude to endure looking at multiple lines, not of code, but of different criteria, there's a bit of a learning curve. Nonetheless, the point here is that folks can access statistics for their communities as they relate to things like sexualized violence. In this particular example, we're looking at Watson Lake, which is a rural community in the Yukon Territory. And we're looking specifically at the number of sexual assaults from level 1 through 3 between the dates of 2017 and 2021. So while these numbers reflect what the RCMP consider actual incidents, that's not cleared by charge, and we're not going to get into the UCR coding that the RCMP use. The point we're trying to make with this example is that we're not able to tell the gender, the sex, the indigeneity based on these statistics. The RCMP, I understand, are launching a pilot project where they're considering including race-based data, this is their wording, in their policies and procedures. However, as it stands now, we're not able to tell very much about who the people were who reported sexualized violence to the RCMP in Watson Lake, a rural northern community. We therefore cannot do a disaggregated intersectional analysis. I'm now moving on to page 13. In the north, as we all know, and especially rural and remote spaces in the north, and by the north here, I'm going to be very careful. I'm not just talking about the territories, I'm also talking about the northern parts of provinces. Resource extraction is big in these spaces. Mining, oil and gas, these are industries that occupy a big portion of the GDPs of our provinces and territories in rural, remote, and northern spaces. What you're seeing in front of you is a decision document for a mining project that is slated to be very close to Watson Lake, the community we looked at in the previous slide. And in the decision document for this mining project called Kudzakaya, which translates to Caribou Country in Kaska, you'll notice that the decision body rendered a term and condition for the mining company such that it would establish alongside the Yukon government a program meant to monitor the effects of the project with special consideration towards violence against Indigenous women in the nearby communities. If the RCMP do not publish disaggregated data, that is, if we don't know how many sexualized assaults occurred against Indigenous women in Watson Lake or in Ross River, how then are pre-project baseline data supposed to be generated? And in turn, what constitutes the evidence or information that will be used to monitor the project's effects on Indigenous women and the violence that they experience? Let's zoom out for a second. This is a perfect example of a decision that was made from data that is fundamentally low in quality. It is an example of a decision that is wholly impossible to implement. I've now moved on to page 14. So again, the point that we're trying to make here is that in order for us to have strong, adaptable, resilient communities that support everybody, but in particular those in the margins of the margin, we need evidence-based policy and decision-making that uses quality data. Quality data, as we've just explored, needs to be disaggregated in order for it to be analyzed through an intersectional lens. The last point is that data needs to be accessible. And if the privacy frameworks restrict who and what can be described in reports, then we need a different way of constituting or building evidence. And that is where our toolkit comes in. So I'm just going to pause for a moment because that was a lot to digest. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And now we're just going to turn to, I'm just going to take a quick second to look at who's with us. Okay. I'm going to ask Jess to plug in our toolkit website into the chat so folks can access it. And I'm also going to fire up the toolkit as well and give folks a bit of a tour of what we've put together. The aim here truly is to mobilize knowledge. We are not interested in gatekeeping. We hope that you can use the contents of this website to support your advocacy in your community. You know your communities best. These slides and this website is meant to help you educate policy and decision makers about why the decisions they're making are based on flawed, low-quality data. We also want to invite you to use the tools on this website in a way that can bolster your capacity as an organization and as a sector, with the aim, again, of building strong, resilient communities. So the website is broken down essentially into what we've been talking about in the slides and webinar today. But this is here so that you don't lose access to it. You know, you can reference this website at any time. We've broken down, again, what constitutes quality data. We invite you to screenshot this, use it. This is non-proprietary. This is here for you to help educate folks in your communities. You'll notice the section on gender-based violence really digs into the components of it as an example. And I'll just point to some really important statistics, because some of the pushback that we've experienced and anticipate is the conundrum or paradoxical question of how can you prove that it's underreported? What reports are there on gender-based violence being underreported? And I'll invite people to consider the contents here, which breaks it down in a very clear way. There's also a slew of reasons and suggestions that you can incorporate into your website, the letters that you write to your ministers and decision makers, and also what you can incorporate into your funding proposals. Before we jump into the tools section, I'm just going to invite people to remember that the National Action Plan to End Gender-Based Violence explicitly names and states that there are data gaps in rural remote contexts. This is literally verbatim, copied and pasted from the National Action Plan's website. I've highlighted those pieces that summarize the essence of what we're talking about here today. The reason I'm suggesting and have partitioned or made a separate component of the website dedicated to the National Action Plan is because I invite you as advocates to reference this particular section of the National Action Plan website as it's messaging directly from the federal government that substantiates exactly what we're talking about, which is that there are data gaps in rural, remote, northern spaces. There's a lack of data, therefore we cannot use intersectional lenses. And that there's a need to invest in different methodologies and modalities for generating evidence and data in rural, remote, and northern spaces. I'm now jumping to the tools section of the website. And what we've done is compiled a list of tools that we understand to be highly useful tools that we ourselves have benefited from in the work that we do. Like I mentioned at the beginning, the Yukon Status of Women Council very much is a community-based research organization. And we see the value in community-based research. Some of the examples that come readily to mind are when we engage in projects that take data from Statistics Canada, the Community Index of Wellbeing, the Yukon Bureau of Statistics, and contrast that with qualitative data, i.e., interviews with people with lived experience. And when we contrast the quantitative data, that is all the StatsCan data and survey data, when we contrast that data or those data with the qualitative data, we see such a difference. We see so much nuance and richness and specific aspects of those issues emerging from that qualitative data that is fundamentally invisibilized or not available because of all the things that we just talked about in the StatsCan data. So obviously we're biased. We value community-based research because that's what we do. And in this toolkit, we have linked to examples of proposals that we invite you to take from. Please feel free. We know how undercapacitated organizations are, and we know how challenging it is to find the time and space to write funding proposals. We also see an immense amount of value in policy analysis as a tool for advocacy. In this particular folder or resource tool, we've compiled a few slightly different, there's two main streams here. We have a really brief how to inform and understand the process of policy making. And that highlights ways to influence policy and decision making. We're not going to go into too much depth, but just know that that's there. There's also a very long but useful manual that we co-developed with Ending Violence Association of Canada and Elva Keep. This is a crash course on how to use policy analysis as a tool for advocacy. It delves into how public policies developed and ways in which you can learn more about that process and ask questions. In the same policy analysis as a tool for advocacy kit, we've got something that we see an immense amount of value in, which is analyzing budgets and analyzing mandate letters using a gender-based violence lens. or an intersectional lens. Again, I'm not going to click into all of these pieces, but just know that they're there for you. We hope you can take from this presentation and from this website really concrete asks and questions. We want to see how the folks who are making decisions, who are making policies, how they understand, or if they understand, the fundamental data gaps in rural remote spaces. We want them to show us what they consider evidence. And so here are a list of questions that you can plug into letters, onto your website, onto your social media channels. Data governance is huge. We work with an NGO called Open North. Data governance is, in effect, ways to develop frameworks for your individual organization, where you can not only ensure you're protecting the anonymity and confidentiality of the folks you're working with, but to also ensure you're using those data in a way that support the sustainability of the services that you're providing. This course, Feminist Law Reform 101 from the National Association of Women in the Law, is phenomenal. I highly suggest taking this course. It's free. You can plug away at it via modules. The level of resources available is, this is a toolkit in and of itself. There are examples of how to write letters, how to engage in media, traditional, social, understanding access to information laws. If you haven't heard of this course, make some time. The last tool that I've placed here is probably slightly contentious, I'll own that. But artificial intelligence is changing the landscape of the world. And for a multitude of reasons, it is to your benefit to learn how to use these tools. Not only because it makes lighter the work you have to do with respect to administrative stuff, but also strategically because we want artificial intelligence modules like ChatGPT to be trained on intersectional analyses as well. In this folder, you'll notice that we have what we're calling the mother of all prompts. You don't really need to know anything other than this particular prompt to use ChatGPT. And I'm just going to give you a quick and dirty example of that. So you don't have to pay for ChatGPT, but using what is in that prompt folder, I'm just going to give you an example. This essentially allows you to build your own prompt in ChatGPT. This is what we would consider to be a meta prompt. So in this case, it's asking you what your goals are that you'd like to achieve and any examples. In terms of how useful this tool is, I can't even begin to describe. And I invite you to play around with it yourself, noting that there are fundamental limitations and that it, as a tool is only trained, or the information that informs ChatGPT's artificial mind is limited to 2021. I would also urge you to fact check everything that is generated from ChatGPT outputs. And I would also urge you to use it as a drafting tool. When I say it makes lighter the administrative work, I'm not suggesting that you're going to write all your proposals using ChatGPT, but you can at least get your first draft done. I think one of the biggest things that we've learned is to assume that folks who are making the policies and decisions assume that they don't know very much about gender-based violence or about data gaps. We saw that in the example of the Kudzakaya decision document. I want to give the impact assessment entity who generated that recommendation the benefit of the doubt. They likely assumed that you could access data from the RCMP about the number of Indigenous women who reported sexualized assaults. But that was an assumption that led to a really bad decision. I'm going to stop right there because I think we're getting close to time. And I'm hoping that we can start chatting Q&A styles, but it's also been a lot of information. So I'm going to invite people to take a 3-minute stand up, move around. That's what I'm going to do, break, before we get into the Q&A portion. So let's meet back here at 14 minutes after the hour. Hi, folks. So I understand that the chat is now enabled. And we are hoping that people can ask any questions that they have. I know we're all super busy. And if you do have questions, you can either plug them into the chat. I'm seeing that there's some potentially mixed messages. You can raise your hand and you can ask a question verbally, I understand. You can plug a question into the Q&A. Or you can sign out and go continue doing the work that you're doing. I want to invite anybody, if you see value in this presentation, to contact us. It's all on the toolkit website. You can find that by going to the Yukon Status of Women Council's website.
I just want to jump in. Sorry to interrupt, Asia. I see Lydia has a question, and I think, Lydia, you should be able to unmute yourself. If it's working. Oh, it's okay. But if somebody else has a question, you can raise your hand and I can give you the permission to talk. I'm also wondering if Jess, maybe you had some question prepared, I think. Is that the case? Or maybe Aisha, you can follow up on some other things that you couldn't talk. Oh, I'm seeing a question in the chat. I can read it to you. What are some other measures of gender violence that need to be collected to provide a fuller picture?
In terms of gender-based violence, for us, if we're taking a systemic analysis, kind of structural analysis approach, that means looking at access to housing, access to resources. Part of what we didn't include in this website is a bit of a shift in, if you will, paradigm that we're, as an organization, trying to promote. We don't think it's possible for us to reform all the privacy laws or to use law reform as a tool specifically to make data more available and accessible. But we think that we should be examining how communities are or are not resourced to respond to gender-based violence. So to answer your question, Nimari, we think that this is a community issue, not an individual problem. So we're not advocating for more data collection per se about individuals through those traditional methodologies. We see value in community-based participatory action research, but we also think that what ought to be included in data is a measure of how resourced communities are to respond and prevent gender-based violence. So that's really broadening well beyond the scope of the individual and being more inclusive of and considerate of whether the community has a shelter, has a sexualized assault center, which we don't have in any of the territories. We have sexualized assault response teams. And we also know that the more rural and remote a community is, the less likely they are to meet that threshold. You know, resources are often distributed based on the number of people who live there. And in turn, resources are often distributed based on the number of reported incidents of things, i.e. sexualized violence or intimate partner violence. But if these kinds of incidents aren't reported, we're continually rebuilding systems that don't incorporate the lived experiences of people who are enduring the violence. So we need a frame shift. We need to consider data that's about communities and whether or not they have the capacity to do rape kits, whether or not they have a women's shelter or a place where folks can seek safety. So I hope that answers your question, but we're really hoping that data can move beyond the individual experiences. We're not downplaying how important those experiences are. We want to amplify the signal, the true signal of individual experiences, but we also want to broaden our scope in terms of what we consider gender-based violence data, because things like housing and access to basic resources like internet and telephone should be considered in how we build robust, resilient, strong communities. Thanks for that question.
And speaking of moving into like more of a collective and community-based approach and not an individual one, what are your wishes about like how people could be involved in this journey that the Yukon Status of Women Council is on about data advocacy? Because I know you're very passionate about that and you really want to see things change. And I know that you don't want to do this alone.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it boils down to funding for organizations. So much of the work that we've done and are doing is because we work in coalition and in collaboration. So much of the impact of our work is necessarily related to the relationships that we have with our community, but also with other organizations nationally. And the only way that we were able to do that is because we got that capacity building money from WAGE. I don't know, I mean, in effect, the capacity building funding allowed us to start digging deeper into the ecosystem and examine the mycelium, the interconnectedness of everything, and to be able to see the gaps in those systems. Our sector's been so underfunded for so long that we simply haven't had the wherewithal or resources to start looking at the bigger picture and examine the gaps. So to answer your question, Catherine, I think it really is, unfortunately, under capitalism boils down to funding, right? We're pro pay equality and costs a lot to live in rural, remote, and northern spaces. If our sector is going to thrive, let alone compete with other industries like government or the mining and extractive sectors, that translates into like having a sustainable workforce that has not just a like living wage, but also a wage that enables them to thrive themselves. We have a project we'll be announcing pretty quick that is examining exactly what we were talking about in terms of thinking about communities rather than individuals as units of data, and ways to promote increased resourcing and infrastructure for those communities based on what we know work in other spaces or in our own space as well. So happy to chat with folks.
We have two questions. I don't know, Asia, if you want to answer to one of them. I know that we have like a couple of minutes left. These are like very big questions, so I'll let you decide where you want to go. You're seeing the two questions. The one in French was translated.
Yeah, thanks for that. So OCAP, yeah, our position on OCAP. I mean, as a research organization, it's, you know, the very basic kinds of training that all staff and team members in our organization take the OCAP course. We don't always, okay, so how do I unpack this? The Yukon is a very unique space. 11 of the 14 recognized First Nations have settled their land claims or in different processes of self-governance. That means that First Nations governments who are self-governing can choose to work with mining companies. And so the OCAP question really does relate to considerations around data governance and who owns what data. And fundamentally, we want to apply an analysis of power in all of the work that we do. Power as it relates to access to all of the things, status, class, money, and so forth. But if a First Nation government owns 50% of a massive mining company, we are not going to ignore in the work we do the disproportionate impacts that that mining company might have on citizens, especially Indigenous women citizens of that First Nation. So OCAP is important, obviously, and it needs to be complemented with an intersectional analysis as well. How much time do we have? 3 minutes, Catherine? Should I try and answer the last one?
Yes, if you can quickly.
If you agree that gender inequalities resulting from patriarchy are the source of gender-based violence, how can we include the influence of male culture in terms of disaggregated data? If I'm understanding that question correctly, how can we include the influence of male culture in terms of disaggregated data? I don't know if I can answer that question. What I do know is that we are in a post-Me Too era. We are in a post-pandemic era where divisive polarization is at its peak. We are seeing robust anti-feminist movements growing larger and larger. And we are in a position right now where we have to consider as gender-based violence advocates how we strategize our kinds of approaches so that we don't fuel increased backlash. This is something we think about a lot in the work we do. And we are fundamentally trying to take a human rights-based approach to the work that we do on top of an intersectional analysis. But things are scary right now, I think, for our sector in many ways. And I hope there's more dialogue about that and more mobilization of strategies and tools so that we can collectively address how to deal with that backlash. I also think it's important, in as much as possible, to be responsive to the issues as they emerge. And we're not interested in fueling anti-government sentiment. We're interested in promoting accountable and transparent decision-making. But these are really big philosophical questions, and questions that do boil down to the strategies that organizations use to do the work that they do. Men, boys, folks who identify as male need to be part of the solution. Fundamentally, we believe that it's about education. And if we're trying to change culture and the zeitgeist, je ne sais pas le mot en français for zeitgeist, but if we're trying to change culture, it needs to involve everybody.
Thank you so much, Asia. That's all the time that we have today. Thank you for your presentation and for all the work that you are doing. It was really a pleasure to work with you on this important project. Please, people, visit their website if you haven't already. We will thank you to, Thank you to our interpreters who did an amazing job today to make this content available to more people. Thank you also to our tech support team behind the scenes. Just a reminder that the recording in French and in English will be available online next week, so check your emails to get the link. And please fill out the feedback survey that will pop up on your screen when the webinar is over. We are happy to get your feedback. So merci, thank you, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. I know your time is so precious. Thank you for giving 90 minutes of it to listen to me. And yeah, like Catherine said, it's all about coalition collaborations. CWF has been immensely supportive in this initiative. So gratitude to CWF as well. Thanks, folks.